Welcome to Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. Our team's goal is to present science-based information about gardening and all things nature in New York's Hudson Valley. Hosts Jean and Tim, along with team members
Teresa, Linda, and Annie,
are master gardener volunteers for New York's Columbia and Greene counties. So if you're interested in gardening or nature, or nuggets of information about what's happening outside your door, settle in. Enjoy the conversation. Whatever the season, we have something to say.
Welcome to Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. I'm Teresa Golden.
And I'm Jean Thomas.
And today with us is our guests Clive Jones and Charles Canham of the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies in Millbrook. Today they're here to talk to us about Northeast Forest Ecology. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we're going to talk more in detail about the ecology of the forest in the Northeast. And we're cheating here a little bit because we saw your webinar at Cary Arboretum. So I'm going to ask you about one of the first issues you discussed. What are the biggest threats to Northeast forests?
Well, we've been talking about spongy moth and the defoliation they cause. It's one of the many introduced forest pests and pathogens that have been brought to the Western Hemisphere over the past 140 years. And I think if you polled most forest ecologists in the region, they would respond that introduced pests and pathogens are the single greatest threat to northeastern forests and indeed in forests in the United States. And it's simply because they have the capacity to essentially decimate an individual species. So we have lost a litany of both ecologically important, economically important, and treasured tree species, whether it was the American chestnut or the American beech, American elms, slippery elms, winged elms. All of the elms are literally decimated by Dutch elm disease. And so the list goes on. Dogwood and anthracnose. Flowering dogwoods used to be one of the dominant subcanopy trees here in the Northeast and even more so down in, say, North Carolina, where it's the state tree, I believe. When I arrived at the Cary Institute in the early 80s, almost all of our flowering dogwoods had recently died from this strange fungal disease that's still not very well understood. It's not entirely clear whether it's native or introduced, but it was a very rapid elimination of just a treasured tree in our forests. The Asian longhorn beetle is the single most destructive forest pest we've encountered. Luckily, it disperses very poorly. It's a big critter, and it disperses. We've done a lot of work with APHIS, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, the federal agency charged with protecting the country from these introduced pests and pathogens. And it disperses slowly enough that it's the only example in which deliberate and very determined effort by people to stop the spread of one of these diseases or insects has worked. Although there's a new outbreak outside of Charleston, South Carolina, that's really pretty terrifying. There's certainly many other things changing the course of our forests, climate change, obviously among them. We have far too many deer in our forests. We suppressed fire here in the East very, very effectively over the last 120 years. And yet these forests historically, particularly the oak-dominated forests, had a historic fire regime, a periodic, maybe every 5-10 years, a light ground fire, and that helped keep the oaks dominant and kept out species like maples. With fire suppression, we've seen a really fundamental change in these forests where maples are now about half of the biomass in our forests. That's a dramatic change due almost entirely to fire suppression. And unlike in the West, where fire suppression has made the forest more flammable through the accumulation of fuel, somewhat paradoxically, here in the East, when you suppress fire and allow maples to become abundant, maple leaves don't produce good fuel for spring fires. As I'm sure all your listeners know, you should not do any outdoor burning this time of year because there's a DEC, a state ban, and that's because fires historically burn in the spring, and the fuel for those fires is primarily oak leaves. And so this is a fundamental change in our forests. They're less flammable now than they were, say, 150 years ago. But of all of those, I would still rank, and I think most of my fellow forest ecologists would rank these introduced pests and pathogens as the single greatest threat.
If we didn't have introduced stuff and they stayed in their own neighborhoods,
They would be the local there, and we'd have different local things here. Ideally, what happens, this is in theory, of course, because there's always going to be introduced because people keep messing everything up. Ideally, everything that is native is going to have a balance.
Well, yes and no. Just as spongy moth populations have periodic, maybe not cyclic, but periodic, and now through the work of Clive and many others, well understood reasons for those outbreaks. Native insects and diseases also have periodic outbreaks.
Oh, okay.
And, in fact, I get asked about how climate change might affect our forests. And one of the things that worries me most about climate change is not the direct impacts on the trees, which turn out to be remarkably resilient to variation in climate for reasons I can discuss. But we really don't understand the degree to which all of these native insects and diseases are influenced by climate. One of the most severe pest outbreaks in North America the last 30 years was the mountain pine beetle outbreak out west, which attacks many species of pines, including the threatened and high-altitude whitebark pines, which is so important as food for grizzly bears. And it's pretty clear that outbreak, this is a native insect, but the Northern Rockies in particular have warmed up faster than any other part of the U.S., and it's pretty clear that those warm winters, in fact, have allowed more rapid development of the pine beetle populations. So, DEC foresters for years compiled reports of all the native insects and diseases. The DEC staffer who was doing that retired, and I think those reports also retired. And so we really need much better surveillance and detection of these, and so that we can understand just how those patterns of outbreaks are controlled. Right now, we simply don't know. Are there native species of insects and diseases that could pose a major threat with, for instance, warmer winters?
So it's unpredictable. The phenology changes are not going to be even across all the different things that are interactive. So the bugs will go nuts and the plants can't keep up.
Like Clive, I try to be precise in the language. It's not so much unpredictable as simply unknown.
Okay.
We would love to have the knowledge so that we could predict at what point with a changing climate might we see those kinds of effects. We simply don't have the information.
But the result is from an uneven adjustment.
I think we're going to face lots of surprises.
Yeah.
I think as particularly warmer winters, we're going to see outbreaks of things that we just didn't have any way of anticipating.
Oh boy.
Yeah, it's worth thinking about that. So if you think about the egg mass stage of the spongy moth, right? It comes from Siberia. Warmer winters, will they do better? Will the eggs be better? No. So what we know is that the egg mass stage is so resilient to anything with you have to, if you want to kill them, you got to go minus 40 for a long period of time. If you warm them up, they're just going to stay synchronized to bud break. So that's an example of where we actually know enough about one particular stage with regard to coordination, phenology, climate, to say something. For the overwhelming diversity of other pests and pathogens in forests, we have no idea.
So the emerald ash borer is a recent pest that obviously has decimated the ash trees around here. Are there other monsters on their way?
The emerald ash borer is really one of the most frightening of the current threats. Unlike spongy moth, the females do disperse, and disperse about as well as any of these introduced insects that we've seen. So actually right after this, I'm going up to the sawmill in Ghent to pick up hopefully some white ash lumber. I use it in the boats I build. It's beautiful wood. I really truly expect that in 10 years we will see almost no live white ash, green ash, black ash, a culturally very important swamp species. It's used to make baskets, particularly by Native Americans in the upper Midwest where it's abundant, but is dying at just phenomenal rates. So again, emerald ash borer was almost certainly dispersed to this region here in the Hudson Valley by humans moving wood around that had the larvae in the wood. But once it gets established and the adults emerge, they fly great distances and have spread like wildfire.
I read a little bit about this and I don't quite understand it. So could you explain the Tree Smart Trade Initiative?
Sure. Both Clive and I spent many years working with a dear colleague, Gary Lovett, at the Cary Institute. Gary, also a forest ecosystem scientist. Gary and I both spent a good bit of our career studying several different forest pests and pathogens, both particularly working on beech bark disease. But we're scientists, and at one point Gary organized a conference to bring together experts to talk about the science. And I think it was depressing, but also a little life-changing for Gary in that he realized that just doing more research about the effects of these insects and diseases on forests wasn't enough, that something needed to be done. And as I said, APHIS, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, is woefully underfunded and works very hard. But we need to be doing many more things to stop the introduction of these insects and diseases. And so Gary came up with a very great acronym, Tree Smart Trade. And the letters in SMART stand for a series of proposals for things that could really make a huge difference in the rate at which these things are brought into the country. The wood-boring insects like emerald ash borer, they come in primarily on solid wood packing material, mostly from Asia. That wood is supposed to be treated. It's either not properly treated or fraudulently treated, and so heavy equipment comes in wrapped in wood pallets, and when those wood pallets are discarded behind the warehouse, the insect emerges and takes off. And the other main source of avenue is through the live plant trade. So a great many of the plants you buy at your local nursery or at Home Depot, they're raised in other countries and brought in. And again, APHIS works very hard to inspect them, but we're talking about millions and millions of plants. And so we need far better funded and efforts to try to stop the introduction. And so that's what Tree Smart Trade is all about.
So you're trying to do a regulation.
You know, it's interesting. Gary, who very sadly passed away a year and a half ago, very suddenly, had just before he died, he gave us a talk about an amazing proposal that I think would really change the game here. And it was to create an industry of companies, primarily in Asia, who would take on the liability risk if an insect got through. Right now, if a ship comes into a port in the U.S. and a single pallet is shown to have an exit hole for an insect, the entire ship and all its contents are turned away. And so the shipping industry takes on the cost. And it's because the shipping industry has to count on the inspection happening where the ship was loaded. And if there's fraudulently inspected pallet material in there, the shipping industry takes the cost. And so Gary worked with the shipping industry to create a mechanism to fund companies that would guarantee that the pallets had been properly treated. This was brilliant. This was just brilliant. And it's my hope that this idea, this protocol, is going to proceed ahead, even in Gary's absence. So we're looking for a replacement for Gary and someone to lead this initiative. It's that important.
Okay, it makes sense.
You haven't talked about jumping worms. Are they a huge impact on the Northeast ecology or not?
Many of the earthworms are introduced, and they do cause big changes in both forest soils and the litter layer where a lot of critters, arthropods, insects, and salamanders and things live. Is it a threat to the trees? I suspect not.
So the trees are resilient. Well, what do they do? Make deeper roots? How does a tree respond to the litter layer going away?
Well, the trees created the litter layer by dropping leaves.
Yeah.
And so those leaves, as they decompose, they release nutrients back to the soil. And as gardeners introduced earthworms to help speed up that process of releasing nutrients from the litter. So the trees probably benefit, if anything, from the more rapid release of nutrients from the leaves.
Okay. So they have easier access.
Drag the leaves down into the burrows. They decompose rapidly. Worms die, they decompose.
Okay.
Nutrient cycling takes care of a lot of things.
So you've been studying forest history, ecology, and movement for decades. It seems to me that you have a larger vision than the rest of us. So what do you foresee, or maybe should I say, what do you hope to see in the future of our forest resources?
Well, I summarize all these different threats in the book Forests Adrift, published a few years ago. And our forests are changing. The forests we have today are a remarkable conservation story. 100 years ago, the Hudson Valley was probably outside of the highlands and the Catskill Mountains, probably 80% deforested, converted to agricultural land, pasture and fields. And as agriculture waned here in the Hudson Valley and as farmers moved to the Ohio Valley once the Erie Canal opened, the forests have regrown, and they've regrown largely on their own. So we have now the Hudson Valley is roughly 50% forested. So that's an enormous conservation success. And yet those forests are fundamentally and in many ways, many important ways, different from what was here prior to, for instance, European settlement. The oak forests are gradually giving way to maple-dominated forests. We really don't know what the understory, what the wildflower species and the understories of those oak forests would have looked like, because plowing that land under completely eliminated them. And the trees are the first to come back, and the wildflowers and the shrubs are slowly recovering. But most of the shrubs in the understory of forests are non-native. They're not particularly invasive anymore, and they're important as habitat for small mammals and birds. So things are changing. This is, the title of the book, Forests Adrift, is sort of my tacit admission that it's hard to really know where the ship is heading. It's just that many of us have an almost romantic attachment to some notion of a forest primeval, of that we could get back to where we once were. That's simply not going to happen. And yet we have healthy, ecologically and economically and aesthetically valuable forests. They're just going to be new.
Okay, I've got a blurb I want to read. Charlie Canham takes us on an inspiring walk through the past, present, and future of Northeastern forests with the wisdom of a lifelong forest scientist and the wonder of a naturalist. Incredibly readable and insightful. And this is from someone at the Yale School of Forestry. And then there's another little blurb in here. You were named a best book of 2020 in the history category by Bloomberg Business Week. And I've read the book. It's really awesome.
Well, I have to confess, the friend at Yale, Indy Burke, the dean of at the school there, is an old friend. So she said very kind words about the book, and I appreciated it.
Our friend Tim, who couldn't be here today, always wants to close with the question, since we've been talking about all these grim and gruesome things, and it's your life that is devoted to studying these, what gives you hope in all this chaos?
Resilience. It's too easy to write and read about very apocalyptic stories of all these threats, and I personally tend to oscillate between Chicken Little and Pollyanna. So the next news report has me terrified, and yet every time I go out in the woods, and all of the frankly very arcane and intense statistical analyses I do with massive data sets convinces me that these forests, and particularly the trees, are extraordinarily resilient. If you're going to stay rooted in place and survive for 300 years, everything that the environment and the humans want to throw at you, you've got to be tough. And, not all of our species are that resilient, but the trees themselves have remarkable adaptations to deal with, for instance, wildly fluctuating climates. And we've discovered that almost all of our species have adaptations that show either genetic adaptation to the details of their local climate or more rapid phenotypic acclimation. So as the climate changes, there's a very good argument that they are going to adapt to that very quickly.
Yeah, I think we tend to forget that all of those species out there carry a vast embedded history in their genomes. And that history includes encounters with and persistence through all kinds of different things. And that, in essence, is the source of that resilience and robustness in nature. And so we tend to forget that. We often think, wow, my oak tree's just been whacked by the spongy moth. That must be it. But no. So that's, I think, and both Charlie and I have the same feeling about that. That's what imbues us with hope.
I love that answer. That's a great answer.
That's
Thank you
Awesome.
so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd really like to thank both of you for joining us. It's been a pleasure. One more time, we've learned so much from each of you, and hope to have you back someday.
Thank you.
That concludes another episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. We would like to thank
Sandra Powers
and Devin Connolly from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties for production support. And a special thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. You can find links to any of the topics mentioned in this episode at our website at ccecolumbiagreen.org. Comments and suggestions for future topics may be directed to us at columbiagreenmgb@cornell.edu or on the CCE Master Gardener Volunteers of Columbia and Greene Counties Facebook page. For more information about Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties, visit our website at ccecolumbiagreen.org or visit us in Hudson or in Acre. Cornell Cooperative Extension provides equal programming and employment opportunities